I get to talk to you about my work working with children who are drug endangered. Mitch Brown spoke just in the prior session about drug endangered children and how important it was to make all of those connections on behalf of children, because when there are drugs and there are children, there's maltreatment and exploitation, and there's such a high risk of that. And just from the talks that we've heard so far, you can see those connections. And I want to talk to you today about when home is not safe, those connections, those issues that happen there, why they make these children in those homes are at highest risk for being exploited. And so I want to share a little bit of that with you this morning, but I have to, or this afternoon, I have to first maybe share with you a little bit about what those risks are and for you to be able to understand those connections better. So, I guess I'm not pointing in the right way. Okay. We know that drug addiction will and can destroy lives, that it can and will tear apart families, and it will impact communities. We do know this, and this is a lot of the work that many of us do. But we also know then that, I don't know why I'm not able to, straight back? Okay, there we go. All right. I don't know why it's not going. All right. Children are often the silent victims in homes where substance abuse is a problem. And this is what Mitch was talking to, is the fact that we were not aware, we haven't been as aware in terms of how much this impacts the child in a separate and different way, that they are individuals that need our attention in a separate and very specific way. So I want to share just a little example of how impactful it is to children. So I'm going to tell you a little story about Rachel, who at school was asked, she was 7 years old, and they had to ask, this was many years ago, what they would do if they were president of the United States. And so she wrote, I don't know why I can't get this going. If I were president, I would get a limousine. So there you see she's drawn her limousine. If I were president, I would get a limousine and help children that have parents that do drugs and put them in jail and find them new parents. Now, she did this as a class assignment. Her teacher did nothing. Nothing happened. She did it in her assignment. Do you think she had voice here? Was she trying to get voice? Absolutely. But nothing happened. You can see it's pretty crumpled and paper. Fortunately, her parents did get treatment. 3 years after her parents had been sober, her mom was cleaning her daughter's closet and found this crumpled in the closet. And even though her mom knew that the drugs had absorbed her, that drugs had impacted her life, they never understood that it had also impacted their child's life. And nothing had been done for that child. And so finally, these many years later, Rachel did get help and treatment, because finally we understood that she needed that in terms of her experience in growing up in a home where it was not safe. So, when there are drug endangerment, when the environment, when the home has drugs, it puts children at risk. And we want to talk a little bit about what those risks. The National Alliance for Drug Endangered Children describes the endangerment in relationship to manufacture, distribution, for cultivation, possession, but it's also children whose parents or caretakers, substance abuse, interferes with their ability to provide that safe environment and to parent their children in that environment. I think this clicker is slowly going away. So what we do know is that when there are drugs and children, we have an environment of risk. We have to be active on that point. When there are drugs and children, we have an environment of potential risk. And I want to talk about that a little bit further. I don't know why I cannot. Okay, I'm going to just give you guys a thumbs up or something. So what we know is that part of that risk is really the impact on parenting. And so what we see then is, if you could click that, please. If you see this picture, this is a father of 2 children. The picture was identified in the home when law enforcement was there. So it was taken to show what their activity was, what was of interest. I mean, we take pictures of things that we're proud of things that we want to share. And so obviously he wasn't doing all of that at once or he wouldn't have been alive to be arrested. But that was what the world was in that environment, in that home. And so what we do know with drugs and parenting is 85% of the states, I think the other 15% of the states were asleep for this survey, because I have spoken in almost every state in the United States, and the answer is true of every line worker, that the number one reason that children come into our child welfare system is because of substances in the home. So it is one of the primary reasons for maltreatment in the home, and that's substance use. What are some of those risks? What does that look like? So we know that there's the issue of physical abuse. If you know something about addiction and you know how, and you're going to learn that in the next talk, and you know how it impacts the brain, and then over time how it depletes the brain of resources, adults with certain drugs, particularly methamphetamine, you can have more paranoia. But you can also just have lack of sleep, all kinds of things going on in the brain, and the aggression and the irritability that happens that results in physical abuse for children. We also know that drugs can take over the focus of that parent, and so they don't have provisions at home. I think that Mitch might have explained to you that in most homes when you go in there, there's nothing that's really suitable for eating, and so the provisions aren't there. And caregivers might not be present or high or crash, those kinds of things. If you could go back, please. And the other thing is we have the increase for sexual abuse, okay? And where we have, because of how drugs work on the limbic system, also which the next presenter might talk about, we have that risk for the desire then, the limbic impact for sexual aberrant behavior. And so that can result in the child also being sexually exploited. The other thing being that sometimes we sell children for drugs. We need the money, so we might sell what we own, which might be our own children. The other thing is emotional abuse. Caregiver frustration, chaos in the environment, no routine, no boundaries, no healthy nurturance that's occurring. And neglect, where we have that lack of regard for safety. And Mitch also talked about what those environments would look like. You may change. And so when we have that, you can change the slide, please. So when we have that, we have children who are in an environment where substances then impact them. This little girl was asked to draw what drugs meant to her. Her family was in a drug treatment program, and she drew this. To her, drugs meant that's when dad will hit me, when he's under the influence. And do you see how big his muscles are? That hurts when he hits me. And so this is the connection that young children are making in terms of the substance use and when home is not safe. We know it can impact all areas of development. The disruption of normal developmental experiences can impact all areas of development of the child. And this is key, which tomorrow I'll talk about more, but it's key to understand what those areas are and how that puts them at further risk. We're going to have to... and so this is an environment that shows you what do you think that development might be like here? What do you think about learning to have attention and focus and language development and all of those sorts of things and meaning making when the environment does not lend itself to healthy, normal developmental experiences? We also know that many things that children learn in these environments are maladaptive, but they were adaptive to the environment that they were in. That includes dissociation, that includes hyperarousal, that includes being in fright. It includes so many things that when it comes into the healthy environment, like maybe school or something, it looks maladaptive. But for that child, it is adaptive. It is not just psychopathology. This is adaptive behavior that child has learned to survive in their environment. And I think let's just pass the video. We don't have time for that. I'll do that tomorrow. What we know is that development, all of it, as a neurodevelopmental psychologist, I'm always amazed at how we are created and all the beautiful things that happen there. But every aspect of development occurs in the context of relationship. Every aspect of our development. And so you can see how parenting is key to all of that. The home environment in which we grow up in impacts that and can have lifelong impact. And it affects us physically, behaviorally, emotionally, cognitively. It affects us socially, emotionally. It affects our meaning making and our values. We also know the risk is intergenerational. We know that children who grow up in homes where there is substance use are at highest risk for they themselves to become substance users. We know that children who grow up in homes where there's family dysfunction are at highest risk that they themselves have families with dysfunction. We also know that children who grow up in homes where substance abuse is a problem are at highest risk for they themselves to become substance users. So the risk is high, and it's intergenerational. This is how a part of that risk occurs that we talk about in terms of vulnerability. We have to understand it now from the broader issues that face children today. We have to understand that in the broader issues of the focus of ensuring justice that this conference is talking about and the issues of trafficking. We have to understand these children from that perspective. I want to tell you, every day I work with children who are not in a home, who've come from a home that has not been safe. I have so many children that I feel like I want to share their story. But I'm going to tell you about two girls whose mother, and could you go back, please? Whose mother and grandmother worked nights in a janitorial job. And their father and grandfather watched the children at night. Now, the family tree on this, the orchard, is so confusing that it was father, grandfather for both, an uncle. Anyway, they were related in multiple ways to these children. Could you go back, please? After several months of sexual exploitation by the father, grandfather, and other male family members, and even non-relatives, finally, the little 8-year-old cousin spoke up at school, and these children were identified. You can go to the next slide. At the time of discovery, there were vaginal and anal bruises all over those girls, and they were 3 and 5 years of age. They had not been identified. They were identified as abused and removed, but they were not identified as trafficked because apparently there was no gain involved. We all know there was gain involved. There were drugs involved, but they didn't pay for the drugs. You didn't have to bring drugs. And now they're in process of reunification. So there's a couple of things this raises. I'm not going to talk about what are my answers to this at the moment. But there are a couple of things. One is we have to see when parents give their children up for drugs, is that trafficking? Do they give them up for sex? Is that trafficking? And if we can answer that, then we also have to look at the fact of how then do we think about the trajectory of those children and what is safe for them. This is things that are hard. Our first speaker said this conversation is a hard conversation, but we must have it. It's not to put blame or point fingers. There is intergenerational stuff for miles for even the people who perpetrate this. But we have to face the issue, and we have to be honest, and we have to have a voice for the children. Otherwise, it will continue to perpetuate. Drug-endangered children are at the highest risk for that intersection of drugs and exploitation. They live in those environments. They have been impacted prenatally and postnatally that have every single element that creates the vulnerability for them to be targeted. The combination of their neurodevelopmental difficulties, the ecology of the drug-endangered environment, puts them at highest risk. That blend will put them at highest risk. You can change the slide. We also know from the ACE study, all of us know now, wow, when things happen to us as children, they impact our long-term trajectory, and it is significant. Folletti, who was the one who did the ACE study, he says it is one of the main things, child adversity. Things that happen to us in our childhood is one of the main things that's affecting the safety of our nations. We must speak up on behalf of this prevention and intervention. So when home is not safe, I take the liberty from our first speaker to say we must not use a passive voice. These are not just maltreated children. And we must put parents in the sentence. Whatever that feels like, however hard it is, and whatever their story is too, we must address it. We must put the trafficker back in the sentence if we're going to help the victims, because otherwise we deny what is going on and we don't then provide the appropriate treatments and preventions for both the parents and the children. They're both at risk in this situation. You can change the slide. So, the important thing, though, we know is there's resiliency. And there is prevention, and there is intervention, and we do have tools that can make a difference. So for children, we can rescue, we can do awareness, we can be aware of drug-endangered children as being at primary risk. We can defend and advocate for them and keep them central in our efforts. We can provide safety and shelter and don't send them back to an environment that will continue to perpetuate. I'm tired of seeing a 2-year-old who comes at 4 from an ACE score of 3 to an ACE score of 10. Let's think about what we're doing and provide a committed community, family interventions when appropriate and as much as we can, healthy adult interventions, substance abuse treatment, mental health treatment, and don't forget that the child needs the intervention as well. So when we're doing this, I call upon each one of us. We must be an active voice. We can't hide behind so many different, it's a complex issue. It's not an easy issue, but we can't hide behind things that don't allow us to face the facts. And the facts are that children who grow up in homes where substances are a problem are at significant risk for exploitation. And we have to define interventions, policies, support programs, consequences that will ameliorate the situation and make a difference in changing the trajectory of the lives of these children. Thank you.